In 1933, in the depths of the Great Depression, the United States quietly committed one of the most radical acts in its financial history. There was no gunfire, no coup, no uprising in the streets. And yet, with a single presidential order, the nature of American money changed forever. Gold, the timeless anchor of value, the metal that had underpinned every coin, every promise, every dollar for over a century, was no longer the people's property. It was now the government's. Picture the moment. Banks are failing. Breadlines stretch around city blocks. Families barter heirlooms for food. The air hums with uncertainty. And then comes the decree, Executive Order 6102, signed by Franklin D. Roosevelt. Every citizen is required to surrender their gold coins, bullion, and certificates to the Federal Reserve. Those who refuse face prison. In return, they receive paper, dollars whose worth is no longer tied to metal but to faith. It was a stunning reversal of the founding promise of American money. Since 1792, the dollar had been defined by gold and silver, honest weights of metal that could not lie. But in 1933, under the pressure of crisis, that promise was rewritten. The same government that once punished debasement with death now debased its own currency with the stroke of a pen. This was not merely an economic adjustment. It was a moral turning point. The day America's money ceased to be a measure of truth and became an instrument of policy. The day citizens learned that value itself could be confiscated, redefined, and controlled. The gold standard did not collapse overnight. It was dismantled by design. And in its place, a new era began, one built not on weight or worth, but on trust, decree, and power. To understand the events of 1933, the year gold was taken from the hands of Americans, you have to step back into a different era. The story doesn't begin with Franklin Roosevelt or the Great Depression. It begins with the long arc of the American experiment itself, and the fragile relationship between money, trust, and power that had been brewing since the nation's founding. For more than a century, gold had been more than a metal. It was the moral backbone of the economy, a standard that promised honesty in a world of paper promises. From the Coinage Act of 1792 through the late 19th century, gold was not just wealth. It was proof that value was real, measurable, and immune to political manipulation. Every dollar that passed through a citizen's hand was, at least in theory, redeemable for a fixed weight of precious metal stored in a vault. It was a covenant between the government and its people. Your labour will not be diluted by the whims of policy. By the early 1900s, that covenant was already under strain. Industrialization had transformed the nation. Cities boomed, railroads spanned continents, and a new class of financiers rose in New York, men who saw money not as metal, but as leverage. The panic of 1907 exposed how fragile that balance had become. Banks collapsed, depositors panicked, and the government had to turn to one man, J.P. Morgan, to stabilize the system. Out of that chaos came a realization. America's financial foundation needed reform, but the solution would sow the seeds of future control. In 1913, Congress created the Federal Reserve System, a central bank designed to manage liquidity, stabilize credit, and prevent panics. On paper, it looked like progress, a modern safeguard for a modern economy. In practice, it subtly shifted the center of power. No longer was money entirely tied to metal in the vault. Now it was tied to policy, to human judgment. The gold standard still existed, but it was increasingly ceremonial. A tether that kept the illusion of discipline while the machinery of credit expanded behind the scenes. Then came the 1920s, the decade of exuberance. The war was over, factories roared, and speculation became the new religion. The Federal Reserve's easy credit helped inflate an illusion of prosperity. Stocks soared, borrowing multiplied, and gold quietly receded into the background. People no longer measured wealth by ounces or coins. They measured it by numbers on paper and prices on tickers. America was dancing atop a volcano, mistaking motion for progress. When the stock market crashed in October 1929, the illusion shattered. Within months, billions in wealth evaporated. Banks failed by the hundreds. Depositors, desperate to preserve what little they had, rushed to withdraw gold, the one form of money they still trusted. But the gold wasn't there, at least not in the amounts the system had promised. Years of leverage and credit expansion had created far more claims on gold than there was gold itself. The truth was brutal. The economy had been built on paper pyramids resting on a metal base that was too small to support them. By 1932, the nation was on its knees. A quarter of the workforce was unemployed, farms were foreclosed, savings wiped out, hope drained from the faces of ordinary citizens. In such times, the old principles of restraint, balanced budgets, metallic money, fiscal discipline, felt cruel and obsolete. People didn't want theories, they wanted survival. And into that desperation stepped Franklin D. Roosevelt, a patrician with a voice of confidence and the promise of a New Deal. Roosevelt understood something crucial about crises. They opened the door to transformation. What could not be done in calm can be justified in panic. Within weeks of taking office in March 1933, he declared a national bank holiday, closing every bank in America. It was sold as an act of restoration, a pause to stabilize confidence. But behind the scenes, his advisors were preparing something far more profound, a restructuring of the very meaning of money. For decades, gold had been both the foundation and the constraint of government finance. It limited how much currency could be issued, how much debt could be created, and how far the state could reach into the economy. To Roosevelt's circle, that limitation was intolerable. They argued that to fight the Depression, the government needed freedom, to print, to spend, to inflate if necessary. Gold, in their eyes, was a chain binding the nation to deflation and austerity. To save the patient, they believed, the chain had to be broken. There was precedent for this logic. Britain had abandoned the gold standard in 1931, freeing the pound to float and allowing the Bank of England to reflate its economy. Roosevelt's advisors looked to that example and concluded that America too must sever its golden anchor. But there was one problem. The American people still held vast amounts of gold in private hands. Coins, bars, and certificates, collectively worth billions. As long as citizens could demand gold for their dollars, the government's power to manage the money supply remained limited. The only way to break that limitation was to remove gold from the people entirely. And so, in the spring of 1933, plans were set in motion for what would become Executive Order 6102. It was a bureaucratic title for a revolutionary act. The Treasury prepared forms, the Federal Reserve readied its vaults, and the government began drafting the language that would compel every American to turn in their gold under penalty of imprisonment. The justification was simple, and to many convincing. Hoarding gold was sabotaging recovery. If citizens would only surrender it, the government could revalue it, expand credit, and restart the economic engine. Few grasped what was truly happening. This was not merely an exchange of metal for paper. It was the transfer of control from the individual to the state. The act would mark the end of a tradition that traced back to Hamilton and the founders, a tradition in which money's value derived from nature's scarcity, not human decree. In the spring sunlight of 1933, as Americans stood in line at banks to hand over their gold, few realized they were witnessing the quiet death of the old monetary world. The coins clinked as they hit the counters, each one a small surrender of autonomy. They believed they were helping the nation recover, and perhaps they were. But history would remember it differently. What began as a practical response to crisis was, in truth, the culmination of a century-long shift, from honest weight to political will, from fixed value to flexible power. The gold that had once symbolized freedom was now the key to control. This stage was set. The old world of sound money was about to give way to the modern era of fiat finance. And though few could see it then, the consequences of that exchange would echo across generations. When Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102 on April 5, 1933, few Americans fully grasped what had just happened. The newspapers described it as a temporary emergency measure, a way to stabilize banks and restore confidence. But beneath the calm legal language was a revolution in the architecture of money itself. For the first time in American history, it was illegal for citizens to own the very metal that defined their currency. Gold, the foundation of the nation's wealth since 1792, was now state property. Those who refused to comply faced up to 10 years in prison, or a $10,000 fine, an enormous sum in Depression-era America. Citizens dutifully lined up at banks, surrendering their coins, bullion and certificates, trusting that the government's promise of fairness would hold. They were told that every ounce would be exchanged for $20.67 in paper dollars. But that was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far more consequential. Within months of collecting the nation's gold, Roosevelt made his next move. In January 1934, he signed the Gold Reserve Act, revaluing gold from $20.67 per ounce to $35, effectively devaluing the dollar by 40%. Overnight, the metal surrendered by citizens had increased in government value, while the paper dollars they received in exchange were worth less. The transfer of wealth was invisible, bloodless, and total. The state had absorbed the people's gold, then redefined its worth. On paper, it was brilliant policy. In practice, it was a moral sleight of hand, an act of financial alchemy. What had once been the people's hedge against inflation was now the government's instrument of it. Yet in the short term, it seemed to work. The devaluation made American exports cheaper abroad and raised domestic prices, easing deflation. The stock market rallied. Industrial production began to recover. To a weary, desperate public, Roosevelt looked like a savior who had turned economic despair into momentum. But the deeper transformation was philosophical. The link between money and morality, between the dollar and something tangible, immutable, and outside politics, had been severed. The government could now expand or contract the money supply at will, untethered from the restraint of gold. The dollar was still officially backed by the metal, but only in name. Ordinary citizens could no longer demand gold in exchange for paper. Only foreign governments could. The golden covenant between citizen and state had been replaced by trust. Trust in policy, trust in leadership, trust in the very institutions that had rewritten the rules. For Roosevelt's administration, this flexibility was liberation. For economists of the New Deal era, gold was a relic of a harsher past. A barbarous metal, as John Maynard Keynes famously called it. The future, they argued, belonged to credit, not scarcity. A modern industrial economy needed elastic money, capable of expanding to meet the needs of production and employment. To them, gold was not a guardian of stability but a straitjacket. The Depression, they believed, was proof that metallic money could not sustain modern civilization. In that ideological climate, the gold standard became the villain, and paper, managed, controlled, and scientific, became the hero. Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau Jr., and Federal Reserve Chairman Mariner Eccles pushed forward a vision of monetary management that would have horrified the founders. They believed that the economy could be fine-tuned through spending, borrowing, and credit expansion, the levers of a new kind of power. And indeed, the economy did begin to stir. New Deal programs, from the Civilian Conservation Corps to the Tennessee Valley Authority, put millions to work. Bridges were built, dams constructed, cities electrified. Paper dollars flowed into every corner of the nation. For a generation battered by scarcity, this sudden abundance felt like rebirth. But behind the scenes, the foundation of that prosperity was no longer metallic or measurable, it was political. The transformation of money mirrored the transformation of government itself. Before 1933, Washington's reach into the daily lives of citizens was limited. After 1933, it became omnipresent. Every public works project, every farm subsidy, every relief check depended on a new premise: that money could be created, spent, and borrowed into existence by decree. The old equation between work, production, and value began to blur. Banks, too, were reborn in this new order. The Banking Act of 1933, better known for creating the FDIC, did more than ensure deposits. It rewired the relationship between finance and the state. The same government that had once punished money manipulators now became the guarantor of the financial system itself. Risk was socialized. Losses could be mitigated. Credit could flow without fear of collapse. Confidence returned not because the system was sound, but because the government promised it would be. By the late 1930s, the new monetary architecture was in full swing. The gold held in Fort Knox became a symbol of strength, a visual reassurance of something solid behind the paper flood. In truth, it was a theatrical set piece. The nation's prosperity no longer depended on the metal within those vaults, but on the perception that it mattered. Gold had become mythology, a relic displayed to keep the illusion of continuity alive. And for a time, the illusion worked. the United States emerged from the Depression stronger than before. By the onset of World War II, industrial production had soared, employment returned, and American paper was trusted again at home and abroad. But the deeper consequence of 1933 was now irreversible. The moral restraint once imposed by gold had been replaced by managerial discretion. The discipline that had anchored the dollar was gone, replaced by a promise. Trust us, we will not abuse it. That promise would be tested repeatedly in the decades to come. The war would bring massive government borrowing. The post-war boom would stretch credit further. The Bretton Woods system created in 1944 would formalize the dollar's new supremacy. Gold backed only for foreign states but paper for everyone else. America had ascended to financial hegemony, its currency the world's reserve. Yet beneath the triumph lurked the same fragile truth revealed in 1933, that the strength of money now rested not in weight, but in confidence. The rise of the new order seemed like progress, modern, efficient, enlightened. But every step forward carried a silent cost. When scarcity no longer disciplines creation, creation becomes excess. When trust replaces measure, corruption begins to whisper. The old monetary ethic, that value must be earned, saved, and held in something real, faded into nostalgia. The gold that once defined the Republic's honesty still gleamed in the vaults, untouched and unseen. But it no longer belonged to the people, and it no longer defined the dollar. The transformation was complete. America had traded solidity for flexibility, truth for policy, and though few recognized it at the time, the seeds of every future crisis, every bubble, every inflation, every loss of faith, were already planted in the fertile soil of that recovery. What rose from 1933 was more than a financial system. It was a philosophy, that money is whatever the state says it is, and that trust, once institutionalized, can replace integrity. It was, in the purest sense, the dawn of the modern era, an era built on promises that could be printed. By the mid-20th century, the goldless dollar had become both symbol and instrument of American power. On the surface, it looked like success. Industry thrived, home ownership soared, and Wall Street glittered under fluorescent optimism. But beneath that surface, the quiet corruption of money had begun. What had started in 1933 as a temporary necessity was becoming a permanent condition, the normalization of control. Once the government discovered that it could redefine money, the temptation to use that power never faded. Each crisis, war, recession, or political need became a reason to stretch the limits a little further. During World War II, Washington financed its armies not with accumulated gold but with paper and debt. The Treasury sold bonds, the Federal Reserve bought them, and the presses rolled. By the war's end, the national debt had ballooned more than tenfold. Yet the victory was so complete, the sacrifice so justified, that few questioned the mechanism that paid for it. After 1945, America's financial dominance was enshrined at Bretton Woods. The dollar became the world's reserve currency, pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, while every other major currency pegged itself to the dollar. On paper, gold still anchored the global system. In practice, it anchored nothing. Foreign governments held dollars, not bullion, and trusted that they could redeem them whenever they wished. It was a delicate illusion, trust backed by promises backed by faith. The illusion held for 2 decades. The 1950s and early 1960s were an age of confidence, suburban growth, consumer plenty, the American century. But abundance bred complacency. Washington financed highways, housing, and an ever-expanding military machine with deficits that no longer needed metal discipline. The Federal Reserve learned that credit could simulate prosperity. Politicians learned that voters rewarded spending more than restraint, and the average citizen learned to measure wealth not in what they saved, but in what they could borrow. Still, the old limits could not be ignored forever. By the late 1960s, the arithmetic began to break down. The Vietnam War devoured resources. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society promised social transformation at home. Taxes stayed low, spending soared, and the gold drain began. Foreign nations, seeing the imbalance, started redeeming their dollars for real metal. France famously sent a warship to New York to claim its gold, a theatrical gesture that exposed the fragility of the system. The United States had printed more claims on gold than it possessed, again Inside the Treasury, anxiety grew. Each shipment of gold overseas was a confession that the promise of 1933 was repeating itself. Too many paper claims, too little reality. Economists urged calm, assuring the public that the system could be managed. But the numbers told another story. America had traded the restraint of gold for the illusion of infinite flexibility, and now that illusion was collapsing under its own weight. The conflict was not just financial, it was moral. A generation earlier, citizens had been forced to surrender their gold in the name of national recovery. Now, the government itself faced the same reckoning it had once imposed on its people, the realization that it could not redeem its own promises. The very act that had centralized power in 1933 was revealing its cost in 1971. When Richard Nixon finally closed the gold window, ending the convertibility of the dollar into gold for foreign governments, he described it as temporary. But like Roosevelt's emergency before him, it became permanent. The dollar was now pure fiat, money backed by nothing but confidence in the state. The cycle had completed itself. What had begun as crisis management had evolved into doctrine. For ordinary Americans, little changed overnight. The stores stayed open, paychecks still arrived. But a subtle shift occurred in the national psyche. Money no longer represented stored labor or tangible value. It represented access, leverage, and credit. The culture that followed, the era of easy borrowing, speculative markets, and perpetual inflation, was born from that moral drift. Inflation in the 1970s was the visible symptom. Prices rose relentlessly, savings eroded, and the middle class watched its purchasing power decay. Each dollar bought less, not because of scarcity, but because of abundance. Too many promises chasing too few goods. Yet the response from policymakers was not repentance, but adaptation. They learned to treat inflation as a tool, a manageable side effect of progress. The punishment once reserved for counterfeiters had become state policy, renamed stimulus. By the end of the decade, America had entered a new covenant with itself. Gold was history, debt was destiny, and confidence had replaced honesty as the foundation of money. The corruption was not the work of villains. It was the slow, logical consequence of every decision made since 1933. Each generation inherited a system more flexible, more abstract, and more dependent on faith than the last. The conflict that had begun as a technical adjustment had become existential. Money, once a mirror of reality, was now a mirror of belief. And belief, as history always reminds us, can be powerful, but never permanent. When Nixon severed the final link between the dollar and gold in August 1971, it was framed as a pragmatic act, a temporary suspension to protect America's interests. In truth, it was a funeral. The last remnant of the gold standard, the final thread connecting money to tangible reality, was cut. And with that cut, the world entered an entirely new era, the age of fiat, a system of pure promises, unmoored from weight, worth, or restraint. At first, it felt like liberation. Freed from the golden anchor, governments could manage economies with unprecedented flexibility. Central banks became the high priests of prosperity, wielding interest rates and money supply like instruments of divine balance. Recessions could be softened, crises postponed, debts rolled over. Paper could conjure growth. For a time, it worked. The late 20th century became an era of financial expansion that seemed limitless. But beneath the prosperity, a quiet distortion spread. When money can be created without effort, effort loses meaning. Productivity gave way to speculation. Saving gave way to leverage. The value of things, of homes, education, even labor, inflated not because they became scarcer, but because the currency itself became weaker. The discipline that once governed economies was replaced by perpetual management, a dance of statistics and sentiment. By the 1980s and 1990s, this transformation had gone global. The dollar, though no longer backed by gold, remained the cornerstone of world finance. Not because it was honest, but because it was powerful. Nations hoarded US debt as if it were treasure. Wall Street turned money itself into a commodity, traded and leveraged in ways the founders could never have imagined. The very instruments designed to stabilize markets became tools of manipulation. Technology accelerated the illusion. Electronic banking, derivatives, and later digital trading detached money even further from substance. Wealth existed increasingly as code, as abstract digits pulsing through servers, infinite, invisible, and weightless. The metal that once defined stability now sat buried in vaults, irrelevant to the feverish motion of finance. And yet, each success carried the seeds of its own decay. The crises that followed, 1987, 2000, 2008, were not accidents, but symptoms. Every collapse revealed the same truth. A system built on credit and confidence must constantly expand or implode. Each rescue required more intervention, more debt, more creation of money from nothing. The discipline of gold had been replaced by the desperation of printing. The transformation was not just economic, it was spiritual. The moral framework that had once defined honest money, that value must come from labour and that wealth must rest on something real, dissolved into a culture of endless consumption. The dollar, once a symbol of trust, became a measure of policy. Inflation, once a crime, became a goal. And yet, through it all, the illusion endured, because faith, even misplaced, can sustain a civilization longer than truth can. By the dawn of the 21st century, the world's financial order stood upon a paradox, more prosperous than ever, and yet more fragile than at any time since 1933. The transformation was complete. The gold standard had not merely ended, it had inverted. Money, which once served the people, now ruled them. The chain of gold had been replaced by the leash of credit, and though the coins still bore the word liberty, the freedom they once represented had long since been priced away. Half a century after Nixon closed the gold window, the legacy of 1933 has come full circle. The United States still commands the world's most powerful currency, but the foundation beneath it is no longer metal, nor even faith. It is inertia. The system survives because it has always been so, because billions of people still believe that dollars will buy tomorrow what they buy today. But belief, like any currency, erodes over time. The ghosts of 1933 whisper through every modern crisis. Each time the Federal Reserve expands its balance sheet, each time Congress approves trillions in new spending, the spirit of that executive order lives again. The idea that money can be created, not earned, that value can be decreed, not discovered. The printing presses have gone digital, the vaults replaced by databases, but the principle is unchanged. The state, having once confiscated gold, now quietly confiscates purchasing power. Inflation, though less visible than Roosevelt's order, achieves the same end, transferring wealth from the cautious to the reckless, from the saver to the debtor, from the citizen to the issuer. The moral inversion is complete. What was once condemned as debasement is now celebrated as stimulus. What was once theft is now policy. A culture that once feared debt now depends on it, and yet, as history shows, every empire that forgets the limits of value eventually collides with them. Rome clipped its coins, France printed its assignats, Weimar drowned in paper marks. America, armed with algorithms and reserves of trust, repeats the pattern in slow motion, stretching the definition of money until it strains against reality itself. But the story is not entirely one of decay. Beneath the layers of credit and code, a quiet resistance has begun to form. As central banks explore digital currencies, programmable, traceable, controllable, others seek escape. Gold, once mocked as a relic, is being hoarded again by nations wary of the dollar's dominance. Cryptocurrencies, volatile yet defiant, echo the old American promise that money should belong to the people, not the state. The debate that began in 1792, between honest weight and official decree, has simply evolved into new forms. Still, the moral question remains unchanged. What is money supposed to represent? Is it trust or control? Freedom or obedience? The founders believed that the integrity of money was inseparable from the integrity of the Republic. They understood that a currency untethered from honesty would eventually untether the people from accountability. When gold was taken in 1933, it was not just metal that disappeared. It was memory, a memory of restraint, of consequence, of the truth that you cannot print prosperity. Every era finds a way to forget this lesson. The screens glow, the markets rise, and the illusion holds, until one day it doesn't. When faith falters, numbers become meaningless, and the cycle begins anew. Panic, reform, control, collapse. That is the rhythm of civilizations that mistake policy for principle. And yet there is still something to learn from 1933, if not to undo it. The gold standard was not perfect, but it was honest in its imperfection. It admitted that value must rest on something beyond politics, on scarcity, on effort, on trust that cannot be legislated. The modern system, by contrast, demands faith in those who govern it. But faith in people is fragile. Faith in principles endures. If there is a lesson to carry forward, it is not nostalgia for gold, but humility. The recognition that no society can redefine value indefinitely without consequence. The founders knew it. Roosevelt knew it. Nixon learned it. And perhaps, in our own time, as inflation returns and digital money looms, we will be forced to relearn it again. Because in the end, money is not just an economic tool, it is a moral mirror, reflecting what a society believes about work, trust, and truth itself. The gold standard of 1933 may be gone, but its shadow stretches over every dollar, every debt, every promise made in its absence. It reminds us that prosperity built on illusion is only temporary, and that when the measure of value is lost, the measure of freedom soon follows. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.